Hey there, got some exciting stuff for us to go over today. We are still in Matthew 14, not for much longer, but we've kind of gotten up to one of the most exciting, most amazing stories. I'm so excited to talk about it. Got lots of thoughts to share with you, so we'll kind of get this going. Now, I do want to point out, back in chapter 8, I hope you'll take a look at this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but back in chapter 8, Jesus saw the crowd around him and gave orders to cross over to the other side. Sounds kind of familiar. He gets into the boat. His disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came up. Remember, and they said, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. And he rebuked the wind and the waves and then said, oh, ye of little faith. The men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? So they had done this before. Here in our passage today in chapter 14, starting with verse 22, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. So they had made a similar journey. They had experienced the storm, but Jesus was ahead of them. They were following him. He was with them. Completely different situation, right? And so this time, it says, Jesus needed some time. This is connected to the death of John the Baptist. He spent some time praying, and then during the fourth watch, the dead of night, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., Jesus goes out to them. Back in verse 23, when evening came, he was there alone. It's very clear. He's alone. The disciples are way out. It says many stadia. That was one of their measures. A long distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against them. One of the important things for this whole story is the image of the sea. You may recall in Genesis 1, in the creation story, everything was just this darkness and God's Spirit floated above the water, and he had to separate the waters out and bring organization to the chaos. I got a couple of other things I want to read to you real quick that I just think are really interesting in this context. So Psalm 69, save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold. I have come to the deep waters, and the floods engulf me. I'm worn out calling for help. And then Psalm 107. This is a pretty neat psalm. You should go read the whole thing. This is verse 23. Others went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. That's cool, isn't it? So the sea, we tend to skip right over that part, the symbolism of it. We get the wind and the waves part, but we need to see this from the ancient perspective, particularly in Israel. But remember, they didn't live on the creek and everybody had a boat. These were not really seafaring people. A few of them were fisher people, but they stayed close to land. They went out. If there was a storm whipping up, you better believe they came back to the shore. They didn't really do storms. They stayed out of the deep water. And in fact, for most of history, even the seafaring people stayed where they could see the shore. Remember, it was, here there be dragons, you'll go off the end of the world. The sea, the open sea, it was dangerous and terrifying. And so remember, as we look at this, as we talk about it, the sea is a representation of chaos and darkness and disorder. And it was only the creative power of God that kind of brought it to heel. But it's always threatening, always ready to engulf us. So the sea has a lot of anxiety built into it, a lot of threat. And in this case, on top of being somewhere where you could die and felt unsafe, the sea is a barrier between them and Jesus. And of course, in this case, it wasn't just their leader. Jesus signified the very presence of God. Because he's alone on the shore and they're way out in the middle of things, it was impossible for Jesus to be with them. And yet, in the dark of night, he comes. When we read this, we usually focus on defying the laws of gravity. He should sink, and that's part of it, absolutely. But this is Jesus standing on chaos. You think of, when you conquer something. I've never conquered anything, but, the conqueror with his foot on whatever, the wild boar, the enemy, standing on the mountain, the symbol of standing upon, conquering something. And Jesus has literally stood upon chaos itself and showed his mastery over it. And this is not obvious on the surface here. Another thing, both biblically and culturally, there was this idea of walking on water, and the ancient world agreed only a God could do that. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, Greek mythology, you see deities walking on water, but never mortals. And in fact, in Job, this is a good one. Hang on a second. I got a lot of notes here. Job chapter 9. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He's the master of the sea. Yes, he is. God alone is the master of the sea. Just file that away. That's important. So they don't recognize Jesus and think, it can't be Jesus. We think it's Jesus, but it's not Jesus. It's not one of those. They just see a figure coming and they think, it's got to be a spirit, something walking on the water. It's actually the word phantasma in Greek. And they're pretty scared because they don't know what to make of this. All very, very reasonable. And Jesus calls back, it makes perfect sense to be afraid, but you can take courage because it's me. It is I, he says. And remember in the other boat story, they're asking themselves, who is this guy? Now they know it's Jesus. And the Greek, it doesn't say it is I. The Greek is I am. Ever heard that before? Yes. Jesus responded, take courage. I am. File that away too. So Peter, he says, if it's you, Lord, tell me to come to you. Jesus says, one word, come. And as we know, he walks, and then he starts to look at the wind, and he sinks. And Jesus saves him, and he says, oh, ye of little faith. Now here, the idea of little faith is kind of like your faith is mixed with other things. You've got some courage. He doesn't say no faith. He says little faith. Your courage was mixed in with some fear there. You were doubting. He says, why did you doubt? And it's not the doubt like, I don't think that's true. The word he uses has more like vacillation, like going back and forth. Why did you waver from courage to fear? Is more like what Jesus is asking here. And so we get the traditional takeaway. I've heard this. I've preached this. I've been taught this. Lots of people have used this. If Peter had only had enough faith, he could have walked on the water. He just had to stay focused on Jesus, right? Just keep your eyes on Jesus and you're fine. There was a great book. I led the Bible study of it one time. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. We would watch the videos and do the studies. Great stuff. I don't deny those or say that they're unimportant or untrue. It is true. We have to be ready to take risks. We have to be ready to do courageous things as Christians. Absolutely true. We do better when we keep focus on God and on the person of Jesus rather than circumstances. Absolutely true. when we are faithful, God can do amazing things through us? 100% true. But I ask you this, is that the message Matthew was telling? Was that the message Matthew had for the church, for the first century believers for whom he wrote this? Is that what he wanted us to take away? And I'm not so sure that's the case. So I want you to kind of roll with me here. I know I'm going against conventional wisdom, but, did Matthew want us to believe that having faith, the sufficient faith, enough faith, will mean that all of our problems will be solved in spectacular ways that violate the laws of physics or biology or economics? Did Matthew want us to read this and say, hey, faith, it's about faith. God, I have faith in you. If you're real, God, we're all just going to go right out there and walk right into the creek. Or, excuse me, we're going to walk across the creek. Let's go. Is that what Matthew wanted us to do? Is that the reaction he was looking for? Did he want us to think that if we had a lot of faith, but the cancer didn't go away, or if our child died, or if the marriage couldn't be saved, that we just didn't have enough, that our faith was lacking somehow, that these things didn't happen because of our lack of faith? Is that what Matthew wanted us to take away? That any kind of failure in our lives is just because we don't have enough faith? I'm not so sure about that. I'd like you to consider with me an entirely different view of this story. And again, I know I'm going against years of training and traditional interpretation and conventional wisdom, and that's okay. As we've been doing this series, I've read a lot about Matthew, the author, and we've learned about him. We also can see a lot of what he was getting at by how he tells these stories. And if you look, just look at how Matthew tells the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water stories differently than Mark. This is Matthew putting his own stamp on it. And I think it's because he had certain things that he wanted us to get from it, his original readers and us, okay? So I'd like you to consider the possibility that Matthew used this story. It clearly happened. It was something that happened that made a deep impression on the disciples. But I think he told it in a way that almost made it into a parable of his own. Okay? So, again, he's writing to encourage the struggling first century church. And here Jesus has told his followers they have to go on a journey without him. Could this be a post-Easter parable? Could we be seeing Matthew visualizing the journey that he had been on with his fellow believers, with his church, thinking of that boat buffeted by the waves, this tiny, fragile little craft that was the early church, fighting against the forces of chaos and darkness with the wind against it. And Jesus had sent them on without him. Their only protection, that little boat that keeps them together. The disciples have this stormy, difficult path ahead. And yes, they've been on it before, but then Jesus was with them. That was different. Now they're separated. Jesus has compelled them to go on without him. And the boat, the word is actually tortured by waves. That gives you quite a word picture there, doesn't it? The wind is against them. That's probably how life felt for the early church. Like there was just torture and obstruction every direction they looked. And the sea, the powers of darkness and chaos threatened them constantly, but also felt like it cut them off from the presence of Jesus. The winds of conflict and persecution always battering away at the young church. Now again, it's impossible for Jesus to be with them on this journey. He went to heaven, forced them to move on without him, and yet there he is at the darkest hour doing something only a God can do, conquering chaos, moving over the surface of darkness. Doing something only God can do, and then identifying himself, saying, you take courage, don't be afraid. And you know why? Because I am. Because the presence of God, against all odds, is here. Jesus is there with them on this mission, even though it seems impossible. And in this story, in this parable of the church, Peter represents all of the disciples, any one of us, at any time in history. He addresses Jesus as Lord. He's a believer. He's got the right view of Jesus as the Christ. He's got a lot of faith going for him, doesn't he? Because he says, I'm willing to risk my life for this, but Jesus, if it's really you, I want you to tell me to get out of the boat. And in this story, that's the problem. Not that he has faith or doesn't have faith. Not that he believes or doesn't believe, but that he goes outside the boat to seek his answers. He abandons his community. He abandons their togetherness because he wants something spectacular to convince him that Jesus is really there. See, that's a little different, isn't it? The problem wasn't that he got out of the boat and started walking and then sank. The problem was that he wanted spectacular proof of the presence of God. And again, Peter is all of us. We would all love to have that kind of proof, wouldn't we? Wouldn't we? The other day, my son says to me, so Dad, how do we know when God's talking to us? And I wish I could say, listen, there was this one time I heard his voice crystal clear. I've known people who had that story, and boy, they would really hold on to it. Wouldn't I love to be able to say, there was this one time, son, when I walked on water and I knew. I don't have anything spectacular. I have lots of little things. You following me here? We would all love to have incontrovertible, spectacular proof of God's presence. We all, just like Peter, we all get overwhelmed when we focus on the chaos, the evil, just the sheer number of things that we as the church have to overcome to further the mission that we're on. It's crazy. We all feel like we're drowning sometimes. We all feel overwhelmed sometimes. We all cry out to Jesus to save us. And you know what? When we call on him, he does. That's still part of the story. He does save us. And he might gently rebuke us. This isn't really one of those stories where Jesus comes down hard or seems frustrated. He's just like, why did you doubt? You of little faith, just kind of shaking his head. Jesus does want us to have greater faith. He wants that for us. But he knows our human nature. We're always going to be vacillating, wavering. It's just how the human heart and mind are built. Our journey is always going to involve sometimes being courageous and sometimes being anxious, sometimes trusting, sometimes doubting. Sometimes we're going to rock on because our faith in Christ is so strong, and sometimes we're going to sink because of our terror of the storm. We're going to go back and forth. We want to be pure, unmixed disciples, but that's a tall order. All of those things are true. They were true then in that situation. They were true after the resurrection for the early church. They're true for us now. And we have to realize that the church is our boat. And it was created by the power of God, by the will of God, by the words of Jesus. It was called into being, and it's to keep us safe. We're supposed to stick together. We're meant to make this journey together. That way, when I'm wavering this way, maybe you're wavering that way. When I'm feeling shaky, then I can rely on your strength. We balance each other out. If I go outside of the boat to try to pursue God or find out my truth, I'm susceptible to so many things. I don't want to be in that position. I don't want you to be in that position. So I'd like you to consider, again, going with my theory, here Matthew has put together the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, right together, two of the most amazing miracle stories. They're so powerful, but look at the subtext. Again, speaking to disciples, to the church. We see Jesus' inner circle, his 12, ready to send away potential believers because they just want them to take care of themselves. Sounds like a warning, doesn't it? And then we've got those same 12 thinking, can we take care of these people, forgetting to include Jesus in their equation and saying, I don't think we can do this because we only have one lunch. And then immediately afterwards, we see Peter, the first disciple, the best disciple, depending on how you think about it. And we see him actually tempt Jesus. Roll with me. What does he do? He says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. Do what I'm telling you to do. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Like, if you are really the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread? Yeah. Oof. If Peter, in an attempt to pursue his faith, in an attempt to feel more courageous or to be sure about something, actually tempts Jesus. He puts God to the test, which Jesus told Satan was not really how he rolled, remember? Oof. So maybe these stories, the way Matthew's telling them, are warnings to us about thinking that we're the good disciples and they're the bad disciples, excluding people, maybe starting to think too much of ourselves, because there's a clear warning that even the best of us can end up actually, this may sound like it's pushing it, but wasn't Peter doing something evil of Satan? It was a temptation. It was putting God to the test, just like the devil himself did when Jesus was tempted. That should make us think twice, shouldn't it? What if Peter, what if we, all disciples, what if we had the faith to just believe that Jesus was with us right here in our boat? What if we didn't feel the need for spectacular confirmation? What if we could take him at his word? He did say, I am. Maybe we can leave the walking on water to God. That's kind of his thing. And we can focus on daring to believe with no spectacular proof that God's with us every day. I know that is mind-blowing. Even the people like our parents, my parents always seem to be watching me. Like I could be outside playing with the teenagers and somehow They knew what I was doing. I didn't understand how Windows worked. But my parents cannot keep an eye on me all the time. I can't keep an eye on my kids all the time. There's no way, but somehow God, the most important being in the universe, cares enough about each and every insignificant one of us that he literally keeps an eye on us all the time, is always there. It's just impossible. But we could have the faith to just believe that God is here, and we could believe that we can make his presence real by how we are together, that his church really can embody him, can become the presence of God in this community as they see us weather storms together, as they see us deal with realities and everyday chaos together with faith, with confidence, with belief that God is with us. Maybe that's more what this is all about. There's a cute song I learned in camp. With Jesus in your boat, you can smile in the storm. Well, do we believe Jesus is in the boat with us? That's all it comes down to. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.